I looked at some of the habits in the list of 16 that you have, and I'm wondering how would you teach those to children whose logical side of the brain is not yet that developed. For example, being thoughtful, as you just said, and thinking about thinking, and taking decisions, or not being impulsive, and those kind of things, right? Most of the children, they're impulsive, aren't they? Right? They'll just see something and then they will decide whatever they want to do. So how do you just give me some examples of how do you teach those kind of attributes, behaviors to children who are like too young, less than 10 years, for example?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show where we talk to the people who have followed their passion to achieve great success and have impacted many lives. If you're new here, then please do consider subscribing to this channel. This episode is being recorded in association with Let's Localize, the organization with a mission to foster micro contributions from communities and businesses to support schools for their need of time, skill, and money. To know more about Let's Localize, please click on the card above or the link from the description section below. I'm your host Ajay Mathur, and my guest today is an author, an entrepreneur, and a globally sought after speaker. She is the co-founder of a company dedicated to providing easy-to-use software for curriculum mapping, assessment tracking, and reporting. She has taught at Yale University and the University of Massachusetts. Her work has led to development of Institute of Habits of Mind, an international institute that is dedicated to transforming the way we teach and the way we learn. She is also a recipient of Malcolm Noyle Award for Self-Directed Learning from International Society for Self-Directed Learning. She's also authored many books. Please welcome Bena Kallick. Bena, welcome to the show.
Thank you. You got that all right. Good for you.
Before we go deep into the habits of mind, your focus of your work, I would like to know, you started your career in psychology, if I'm not wrong,
That's
and then
correct.
moved into education.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about it. What inspired you to move from psychology to education?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a long time ago, but surely it really was a couple of things. I was working and very much involved with doing testing of young people in a psychiatric hospital. And I was also doing some work with developing educational programs for children who were in therapy. And that led me to an interest in education. And probably you might have guessed, having 3 children took me further there. And I really realized, because having 3 children, each with very different talents, excuse me, with very different talents and very different skills and very different interests, I started to realize that education is quite a complex thing, and that we were trying to sort of fit everyone into one little mold, when in fact that was not really possible. So I was very intrigued with the idea of what would it look like if we opened the doors to education. And interestingly enough, one of the first places I went was to England. And I was very interested in the Freuble Institute, which was a place at that time, this was in the 60s, and it was a time when people were just beginning to start talking about open education. And open education, of course, in its originality when it began, was really more psychologically oriented during the war years. And it was actually created as a beginning with Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. And she was very much interested in how would we educate our young people while mothers are going off to be nurses in the war, while we are losing many of our female population to war kinds of jobs. So we were really now needing to, at that point, during the war, we were needing to have education for children, and we had to think about it with large numbers of children. And that was actually between the Freuble Institute and Anna Freud's work and the coming of the work of Jean Piaget. All of that kind of came together. There were other great minds as well, John Dewey, a lot of people who were all asking the same kinds of questions. How do we do education as learning, not just schooling?
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the beginning of having too many children in a classroom, 40, 50 children in a classroom, what were we going to do? And that was the beginning of the understanding of the open classroom. The open classroom was really designed so that kids could actually have a very experiential kind of education, and that would mean that it was organized into some learning centers, some ways of kids to have social understandings together, and it really began to open the door to a lot of very fine thinking. As a result of that, and after the war, and then as it continued to grow, people started talking about the idea of what would it look like if open education actually became something that schools engaged with. And that was the beginning of thinking about open education in terms of what might it look like if we were actually taking 25 kids, for example, and giving them some kind of experience that was all about thinking about, and this was very much from the work of Jean Piaget, Vygotsky, John Dewey, was really saying that we were learning more and more that the learning is often in the doing. So there's a lot of head talk that you have to have, which is you have to understand, like I'm talking to you now, and I'm hoping that I'm giving you enough information that you can digest. But it actually becomes real when you go into the actual learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
So we started to understand that it was what we called at that time learning by doing, which is you can take in so much and then you have to apply it. And then you have to think about what did I just learn, meaning you have to reflect upon it. And that kind of was very much the movement that led into what do we know about how people think. And that was really where I started to get even more involved because my experience was very much in the area of understanding child development, understanding psychology and how people think, and understanding more about what would really make sense for schools if they were to do this work and not become therapists because that wasn't their intention, but to become people who were the kind of facilitators of a different kind of learning. That was my beginning.
And I think your background in psychology would have helped you immensely because that is one thing that I believe that the currently teachers, some of them do, but not all of them do understand the psychology aspect of learning and behavior, isn't it?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is certainly it has been a deep interest and it's something that I'm very much knowledgeable about. But I do think that as I've worked with teachers, I think there are a couple of things because the first thing that I did when I started really shifting into putting my focus on education was I started a teacher center. And again, the teacher center concept comes from England. So a lot of the work that I did in the early years was really a lot of work that was adopted from or adapted from work that was going on in England. But the idea of the teacher center, from the perspective of where I was taking it, I associated it with the university. And I said, if teachers are going to get their education and they're going to teach differently than the way that they were taught. So this is something that you learn from a psychological perspective. It is very hard to teach when you've never had the experience of what it feels like to be taught differently.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of really generating lots of different ways for people to learn as adults, and then making sure that they had real opportunities to work with children in new ways. Because too often what would happen is you'd learn, you'd get your master's degree, you'd be very enthusiastic, and you go to schools that were saying, that's not the way we do business here. And so there's that very difficult situation that has continued to haunt us, which is knowing what's in the best interest of kids and always feeling like the legislators, the policymakers, the people, the way I say it very often is, I think that there's an inverse relationship. And the inverse relationship is the further you are from the daily lives of kids, the more certain you are what you should expect from them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the people who make policy, who are the legislators, are far from the daily lives of kids. And so they are busy testing and standardizing and trying to figure out how to make this work. But I think that they have not really often been in classrooms where you're dealing with kids who are very real, very energetic, very alive, and very eager to learn, and really not as eager to be bored.
Mm. And what else does the open education comprise?
Well, open education basically began to develop, and it really became a set of school principles, principles meaning PLES, a principle of learning, which has continued throughout. So as it transformed and as people worked with it, people at first started thinking maybe it was just an architectural change. Like if you put cubbies and if you took kids away from desks and if you put little beads and things to create environments, that would do it. Well, creating good environments works, but there's also all the structures that you need in order to be open. And I think that's where it's most misunderstood. It isn't like anything goes and it's a free-for-all. It's a highly structured environment that really invites kids to explore, to investigate, to inquire, and to begin to apply their learning.
And that is happening in addition to the curriculum that they're studying, right? So you having some separate classes to do that, or how does it
No,
practically work?
that is the way that you learn the curriculum. So
Oh,
let me
okay.
give you an example. For example, you might be if you're let's say a young person in elementary school, you might be very much interested in the topic, and often it's teacher generated topics because the teachers are generating on the basis of curriculum. So maybe the generated topic is we're really going to learn everything we can about plants as living things. Okay, well, that's really interesting. So we have a couple of things that we could do. We could give you a textbook and we could say, here's the chapter, and you're going to learn that plants have stems and leaves, and here's how it works, and photosynthesis. You could learn all that. Another way that you could learn it is you could get that information. But as you're getting that information, you might say, I wonder what would happen if we had plants in our classroom. I wonder what would happen if we had to have them have so much sun. And maybe what we could do is experiment. And some would be in a place where there's a lot of sun and some where there's not so much sun. And we might document that and record that and understand what's the difference. So that's just a very small example, but it would move you into investigating what you're learning and discovering whether in fact you have learned it, A, and B, also, what questions arise for you? What kinds of things does that make you think of? And those are the early ways that you begin to learn what interests you. What do you pursue? What kinds of things are you really curious about? But the most important thing is that your curriculum is designed to engage your curiosity.
Exactly. And going more deep into the core of your work, which is the habits of mind, tell us a little bit more about habits. You have 16 of those. Give us a kind of brief summary of those habits.
So, I mean, in a way, I've referenced it without naming the habit, because what Art Costa and I, when we first met over 30 years ago, and we started doing the study because everyone was talking about thinking, the importance of thinking, which clearly there is a great importance in learning how to become a critical thinker, a creative thinker. How do you really develop thinking? And we started saying, well, what we want to explore is what are the dispositions or attitudes that you need to have to be an effective thinker. Mm-hmm. So for example, you could say, my teacher taught me that when I have to compare and contrast something, I use a Venn diagram, and that really helps me so that I can compare and contrast. But the disposition is different. It's not that skill of knowing how to do that, which is important. It's actually the skillful behavior you have when you say, and it becomes a habit, hopefully, when you say, I'm questioning, and I'm really not sure whether these two things are comparable or not. So I have the attitude of question. One of the habits of mind is questioning and posing problems. So I'm saying that I may have the skill, but I also need to have the attitude of investigation in order to use that skill and really make it make sense to me in my life. So the dispositions and the attitudes are what I would call the kinds of habits that you develop that keep giving your life meaning and keep giving your way that you behave deeper and better and more effective meaning. So I become a better problem solver when I can question and pose problems. I also become a better problem solver when I can use the habit of thinking flexibly. I become a better problem solver when, as I'm doing my analytic work, I'm striving for accuracy. That's another habit. I can say that when you are asking me these questions and you are listening with understanding and empathy, that's another habit. So these habits really are ones that we use in our lives all the time. They are so important to everything that we do, not just academic work, but also in the workplace, not just in the workplace, but where we find the joys in our lives. For example, one of the habits is responding with wonderment and awe. And we find that when young people realize that they can celebrate what they see, I hear students all the time saying to me, "Oh, that's really awesome." But I think if we respond with wonderment and awe and we develop that habit, we're going to ask the question, what about it made it really awesome to you? What was it that you really found was so good and so important about it? When young people go to a field trip, for example, and they take a photograph of everything, why? They have phones, they can click, they begin to take a photograph totally of everything. For us, when we come back to the classroom or when we get back home, if we're parents, we might say, well, now go through the 30 or 40 photographs that you picked, and now tell a story from it. What would the story be? Which ones would you select and what would the story be? Or we might say, you said that those were the ones that you chose because things were so awesome. Go back and now pick the ones that you really feel describe what struck you, what resonated with you, what you really liked about it. So in other words, the habits of mind are those that keep asking you to be a deeper thinker, to be more thoughtful about what you do. The last thing that I would say about it is that we say that it really inspires thoughtful behavior. And one of the things that we mean when we say thoughtful is full of thought. My mind is active, I'm full of thought, but also thoughtful. I'm sensitive, I'm caring. I listen because I care to hear what you have to say. I raise questions because I care and I'm curious about how you're thinking. So there's the opportunity to do what we now refer to as social and emotional learning, because we're really asking you to use these to be sensitive to one another. One of the habits we have is thinking interdependently. So we ask you, don't just jump in and start to be a group without thinking about how will we influence each other? How will we work with one another? So these habits become life skills in which we develop full of thought and sensitive and caring.
That is really interesting because when I first read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, I was already working, right? So I passed through my student life. And I thought if I knew it while I was a student, maybe I wouldn't make any sense of it, whatever is written. So from that point of view, it looks like it's a quite good idea to teach it as early as possible. But at the same time, I looked at the some of the habits in the list of 16 that you have, and I'm wondering how would you teach those to children whose logical side of the brain is not yet that developed? For example, being thoughtful, as you just said, right? And thinking about thinking and taking decisions or not being impulsive and those kind of things, right? Most of the children, they're impulsive, aren't they? Right? They'll just see something and then they will decide whatever they want to do. So how do you just give me some examples of how do you teach those kind of attributes, behaviors to children who are like too young, less than 10 years, for example?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that I think everyone has a logical system that they're developing. It may not be the one we're trying to teach them, but they do.
Mm-hmm.
When a toddler trips and falls, or when a toddler stands up and falls down, something goes on inside the brain that says, that's not working. Maybe I have to try this again. So in other words, that toddler is persisting one of our habits. It's just that we don't recognize it as such because we don't think of it in that way. But I would challenge anyone to say that after observing a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, an infant, that you don't see some of the habits actually occurring when they're playing with their kinds of things that are hanging on their crib, and they're getting excited and they keep jumping and getting more and more excited. Well, that's wonderment and awe. But it's really different because they're not using an academic language to describe what they're experiencing. So part of what we do when we're trying to teach young people is give them that language. Because what we've learned, and I think that the work of Mark Brackett in the area of social and emotional learning has made this very clear in his studying, that when you have a name for something, it really is helpful to you. So thinking about your thinking is actually having the language to be able to describe how and what you're thinking. We call that metacognition. And we mean that it's about how you're thinking. So now, if I were to say to a little one that when they have language, because I think at the beginning you're trying to develop the language, I would say, wow, Jonas, good for you. You were persisting and you got up again. Keep trying. I would say to a little kindergarten child, I know that it's hard for you to wait for your turn, but we're going to ask you to be managing your impulsivity. How can you do that? So the point is that I give you the name, but then the second thing I have to do is give you the strategy.
Yeah.
So I say, how can you do that? Well, I can't tell you how many kindergarten teachers have used this, but anyway, it's really like I went into this wonderful, wonderful kindergarten classroom, and the teacher said, I'm so glad you're here to visit. I want them to know who you are. Boys and girls, this is Bena Kallick, Dr. Bena Kallick, and she was the author of The Habits of Mind. Ooh, they're very excited. Author of something that they've been asked to do. So kids, I want you to show her what we do when we're really kind of losing it and we want to just jump out of our seats, or we get up and we're raising our hand and we're not managing ourselves. You know, we're not managing our impulsivity. What do? And every kid in the room went, stop, think before you act. Beautiful. Kinesthetic gives you the movement, gives you the idea, and that vocabulary. Those little kindergarten kids, they love that big word. Impulsivity, cool. That's a nice big word for me. It's when you get to the middle school where the kids have apathy and they actually don't think these words are really applying to them. That's the harder time, because that's when you're beginning to help them to understand that when they manage their impulsivity, for example, we're now talking about some pretty tempting things that go on in their lives that they're having to manage. And so that's where we really have to get them to think about, what strategy can I use when someone is trying to get me to do something I know I really shouldn't do? And impulsively, emotionally, I may feel, whoo, that looks like a good idea. But the rules in my head say I really shouldn't be doing that. Now, what strategy can I use now? And so we help the students to learn, what strategy can you use? Can you breathe for a moment? Can you stop yourself? Can you say inside your head, why do I remember that this is not a good idea? What are some things that I can do instead? Can I be thinking flexibly right now? I want to continue to be with everyone, but that's not what I want to do. So we are now beginning to build a relationship between the habits as well. So that we're saying it's not just managing impulsivity, but what will you do instead? How do you begin to think of alternatives? That's thinking flexibly. So the whole idea is that if you start them when they're very young and you're actually building the habit, you're building all these ways for kids to begin to have what I would call a mental Velcro system. Everything sticks to it. So it really begins to stick.
This is really interesting because the earlier you teach them stuff, they will be ready sooner. And this actually was proved in my last week's interview with Esther Wojcicki I was talking to you about. Her class is always doing something. So she says that only 10% of the time she's doing lectures, rest of the time students are doing something on their own. So like they're producing a lot of media, like proper New York Times sort of media for their local school. And I think these are the kind of habits that probably help those students to produce that good quality work so early. That's
Yeah.
great, really interesting. There's one habit that you had about striving for accuracy. And I was just thinking that we are actually trying to teach them to be perfect, isn't it? And perfection is enemy of action, right? If you're just trying to be perfect, 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 you probably wouldn't even do it. So how would you strive for accuracy without getting into the trap of being perfect? And how will you
Okay.
teach that to children?
Okay. So the way I think about it, first of all, I want to point out that every one of the habits is an ing word. It's striving, it's persisting, it's managing, and it's intentional, because every one of those words implies growing, not mastery, growing.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're striving for accuracy, I'm not asking you to strive for an A. I'm not asking you to strive for perfection. I'm asking you to be enough of a craftsman to care about the work that you're doing. And if you care about the work that you're doing, then you will be striving to make it as good as it can possibly be. But it doesn't mean it's perfect, nor does it mean that it has to be. And I think tied to that also is what we call taking a responsible risk. Taking, ing, a responsible risk. And one of the reasons that we say that is because all risks aren't worth taking. So we say, when teachers often will say, well, just take a risk on that. But all risks aren't worth taking. So how do we help kids to know what a responsible risk is?
Mm-hmm.
It's really an educated risk. I'm an entrepreneur, and I can tell you, I had to take many responsible risks, but it didn't mean they all worked. I was striving for accuracy. It didn't mean it all worked. It meant that my mental disposition was to give it a go, but to know that it wasn't just a loose idea, because I had a certain amount of judgment, hypotheses, whatever it is that helps you to go ahead and take a risk, that really says, I'm not going to be so editorial about it that I won't try. But on the other hand, it may not work. And how can I live with that? What is it that I have to think about? So I think that, again, to me, striving for accuracy is really the willingness to put yourself wholeheartedly into making it as good as you think it's possible to be, without feeling like mastery, perfection is what you're after.
And you also have a habit about finding humor, right?
Very important.
Now, everybody is not humorous. At least they consider. Some people say that, oh, I'm not funny. My sense of humor is zero, right? How do you address those kind of issues? That some people are actually funny, some are not.
Finding humor is different from being humorous. Finding humor means that we're in a situation right now, and it gets very tense. I'm in a group meeting, it gets very tense, and I might be able to just find the humor in it. So I relieve the tension within myself by saying, gosh, this is really silly, and I can see that. Or it may be, which is really interesting, because one of the ways that we can identify giftedness in students, and this is true, is We can find giftedness when we know that they can understand jokes, because finding the humor in a joke is really important. Finding the humor in a cartoon, really important. When you're watching some of these crazy cartoons on television, finding the humor in it, that's what you're looking for. So it's about finding the humor, not necessarily producing the humor.
That is interesting. And when you said finding the humor, I kind of started smiling because sometimes I remember when I go and tell some joke to my mom, and then she was like, "Okay, so what?" And then you have to help her find the humor in the joke, so that they can. Then she will say finally, "Oh, okay, right. Now I laugh."
Well, also, I think that we all find things so personal that sometimes, somebody is teasing and they're just finding humor, and you're like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lightness of heart when your attitude or your disposition is to be willing to find the humor. Now, the important part of that is, of course, don't find the humor at someone else's expense. Finding humor is really, the humor in a situation is different from the humor about someone.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So how do you practically, so you said that you make it a part of curriculum. How does that work? You have these habits, 16 habits being taught in the schools, and what kind of schools do you have partnerships with schools, or where exactly is your main focus? Could you tell us a little bit operational side of the work, please?
Sure. What we do is, well, first, if you go to our website, which I'm sure you can help people to find, you'll see, but we have a variety of things. The first is that Art Costa and I have written, I think, 15 books right now. So we have a lot of books out there. And I think that would be like one very clear thing. A lot of people buy our books. They're very excited about it. A second thing that we have is that we partnered with a number of people, as you've partnered. So we partnered with Wonder Grove Media, this is Terry Thorne, who was the producer of the Rugrats. Are you familiar with Rugrats?
No.
Okay, it's in the U.S. That's a big cartoon.
Okay.
And so he was the producer of Rugrats, and he knows how to do animations. He's Hollywood. He's brilliant, and he fell in love with the habits. And he said, "I'm going to help you by doing an animation for each habit." So if you go to our website, you'll see that he's done a 3-minute animation for each habit. That's a great way to introduce it to the young ones. So that really is wonderful for kids preschool all the way to 3rd grade. And now he's made it so that it's up to 6th grade by having another set for older kids. So that's a great way to get started. Another is that we have a partnership with EduPlanet 21, and that's part of something that I helped to found. And that is where we do online learning. So there's a lot of online learning that we provide there. And then that gives people resources. Then people get very excited about it. And if they decide they would like to certify their school. So we have a certification program. And the certification is what we call International Habits of Mind Learning Communities of Excellence. Now that's a very long title, but we felt very much that it was terribly important that we wanted to make sure that we weren't saying perfect schools. We weren't saying forever schools. We were saying that they are growing and learning continuously. And so we did that, and we have them all around the world. And then we have what we call affiliate centers, which we have international centers around the world. And I think that would pretty much, and then we also certify professional development people so that they can be trained to offer the professional learning with the habits of mind. So it can be as kind of responsive as, I just want some resources, I'm going to get started, and I want to be in a network of communication about how people do this, to all the way to certification and commitment to the habits of mind with their schools.
So your target audience are, you reach out to parents and teachers and students, all of them, right?
Correct.
Mm, okay. There was one thing I was thinking of, like the habits of mind. So you have come up with a list of 16, which is quite a good list. And there must be some overlap also, isn't it? Or they are like completely segregated. I mean, I've read them superficially, not gone into the detail. But do you find some overlaps? And I was just thinking if it could be, um, I don't know. I'm just trying to remember them.
Yeah, that's okay. What I think you're saying is true. I mean, I wouldn't say overlap so much as clustering. They're
Hmm.
interrelated. So for example, if you're persisting, which is one of the habits, if you're persisting, if you continue to persist and it's not working, you're just being stubborn.
Mm.
So if you're persisting and then you start to try another alternative, you're thinking flexibly. So that often they work together
Hmm.
and they combine and they cluster together. And many people have said, well, could you combine them and use them, like, for example, with Covey's work? And by the way, Covey does reference our work. In his work on leadership in schools, our habits of mind are referenced. So we're very compatible with Covey's work. But what they've done is they have these 7 habits. If you look, and many people have done this, they take our habits and put them underneath because theirs are what we would call nouns, like goal setting is a noun. But then the behaviors, what do you need to do to be setting goals? That's where you might say, I need to be questioning and posing problems if I'm going to set goals. I need to, so we look at the behaviors, and many people have said, I'll take the noun and then put the behaviors underneath. For character education, honesty. So people say honesty, that's a noun. But what behaviors do you need to demonstrate to show that you're honest?
Of course.
So that's how, generally speaking, they interrelate, they combine, but we've never said, here's a group and here's why, because they are so open to interpretation, because they are open to situations. In this situation, these things work. In this situation, these things work. So we feel as authors, if we came and said, here are the ones and here's where they go, people would limit their thinking.
So your habits, actually, you are mainly focusing the education sector, but every single habit that you have put together is so relevant to everyone, regardless of their student or whatever stage they are in their lives. Is there any customized version of this for the older people who are in jobs in corporates, than the one for students?
We just published an ebook that we're very pleased with called Leading Learning Organizations with Habits of Mind. And it is a business combination. And again, you'll see it on the website. It's very inexpensive. It's an ebook, and we take it on in terms of how do these fit. So what we did was we divided it into categories that we felt were most important in terms of the work of businesses and organizations. We call them learning organizations because the way you would get interested is because you really want to learn about. So we said, okay, if you want to be continuously learning, inventive, innovative organization, then we said you want to have employees who are self-directed, because that's really important. And so we then defined self-direction, and because it works for education as well as for businesses, we make the combination. So we say a school is a learning organization, a corporation is a learning organization. So we say, if you want to become self-directed, we put 3 categories. We said you need to be self-managing, you need to be self-monitoring, and you need to be self-modifying, meaning you need to be open to feedback, you need to be monitoring your progress, you need to be managing your planning process. So we did that, and we put the ones underneath that. And then we said, and as a leader, you also need to be managing others, monitoring others, and helping others to modify their work. So it's really putting that all together.
And this is so relevant in the current time when everybody is working from their own personal space in their houses when everything is locked down. So I think your values are really relevant because everybody, say, in the days 2 years ago, 3 years ago, every company has their own corporate values, but not every employee actually follow those values. Now the time has come that every individual should have the values which should be in alignment with the company that they work with. So I think these things that you mentioned, self-managing, monitoring, and modifying, had become so much more relevant now than ever before.
And for our students as well,
Exactly.
because, they are really very much on their own so much in this pandemic.
So there's one question that I ask all my guests, which is what are the three, well, the answer could be in your 16 habits, but I still will ask, what are the top three skills or behaviors that you believe everyone should have in order to grow and be successful, but they are not taught in schools?
So I'll pick three of the habits, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think, to me, the most important ones are listening with understanding and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That's one. I would say the second one is questioning and posing problems. And the third would be remaining open to continuous learning. So if I had to put a high priority, I would put those three.
Why do you put it in high priority?
Because I think that in order for us to really be a global community, and right now I think that the spirit of where we are so much faced with this challenge as to what it really means to care about others. Mm-hmm. So to me, being able to learn about other cultures and have empathy and understand who they are and what they represent, yeah, and to really be able to think about that. I would say to be able to question rather than knowing the answer, how about questioning and figuring out what it is you wonder about and sparking your curiosity, awakening your curiosity and being open and to ask questions and then posing problems, because I think the way we pose the problem often leads us to very different solutions. So how do we think about how we're posing problems using our, design thinking? And then finally, I think remaining open to continuous learning simply means, don't ever think you're done, because it's not happening. I think you really always want to remain open. And I think it's what actually, I can speak from my age right now, it's what keeps you young. Yeah. Because when you're remaining open to continuous learning, then you're always thinking, just as you said to me, well, maybe you need to record a different way. And I'm thinking, oh, maybe this time I'll try Screencastify, because I've heard that's a really good way to record. So I'm always open to learning, not in the last 6 minutes, but, I will pursue it, because everything is a challenge when you're trying to really stay abreast with everything that's going on. So that's why I chose those three.
Thank you very much. That was quite insightful. Now that your habits have reached to so many students, and you've written so many books, what's the plan next? What's your future objectives from now on?
Well, actually, I've moved into an area with a colleague, Allison, zmuda, and we've been doing work now on what we're calling personalizing learning, because we feel that that's really something that people are needing to pay attention to. And so we wrote a book called Students at the Center, Personalized Learning with Habits of Mind. So we're combining personalizing, like how does the individual come to real aspirations and desires and passions, but how do they do it through combining their development of the habits of mind? And how do teachers keep students at the center of learning and move from teacher direction so much to student generated and student co-creation? So that's my area right now that I'm playing in the most.
Okay, and your focus is mainly in the US, or I know that you have some presence in some of the countries, but tell us more about your international presence outside
Well,
of US.
yeah, I mean, I work with people all over the world. So right now, I'm doing a very large project in Brazil. We have a center in Singapore. We have a center in Wales. Um, we have a center in New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. So we do, and Cambodia. We have a wonderful person in Cambodia. So yeah, we have people kind of all over the world. And so my work is really always like I'm very available right now, amazingly, more international work because we're all on Zoom. So
Yeah.
they don't have to have the cost of travel. They don't have to have all the other things. When they were hiring me to come, it was not only my fee, but all my travel. Now, hey, we'll just get you on a Zoom for 90 minutes. Cool. So it's changed, and it's changed my learning about how to do this and do it well.
Mm.
So that if this is where we're going to be, it's going to certainly change my life, and I want to, figure out how to get really good at it.
Yeah, definitely. And your work is so global in nature, like everybody anywhere in the world can learn from it.
Oh,
Um,
by the way, we do have it in multiple languages. So if you looked under resources and then you look for world languages, the habits of mind have been translated into many different languages.
wow, definitely. I'll put all of those links down there. And finally, Bena, how can people reach you?
Well, you have my email address. I guess that would be probably the best. So do you want me to say it, or you're just going to
Say it,
link?
yeah, I'll put it on the podcast also, so it's good that people listen it.
Okay, so it's Kallick, Kallick .Bena, BENA, @gmail.com. And then the Institute website, and if you went to support for the Institute website, it would ultimately come to me probably also. And that is habitsofmindinstitute.org.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bena, for your time. I really learned a lot, and I'm going to go through your full list of 16 habits and try to make sense of them myself. I've not read your book, I have to admit, but I will definitely. It's quite interesting work. I've seen a lot of your YouTube videos, and they were really good. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Guys, if you're looking to know more about Bena's work, then there is a lot of information available on her website. I'll put all the links in the description so you can have a look at it. Her habits are a big and a very grand extension to 7 habits of highly effective people, although they're not directly related, but it's something that that is worth knowing. So please do have a look at it. And if you have not yet done so, then please do consider subscribing to this channel by hitting the subscribe button down there. I will see you in the next episode next week. Till then, goodbye.